This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Beginning today's show is K-State law professor Roger McEowen discussing a variety of topics that could be impactful for producers. He covers buying farmland with a growing crop, what is livestock, a veterinarian's lien, and employee retention credit this week. Weed specialist at K-State, Sarah Lancaster, keeps the show going with information about muster weeds and how they can be controlled. K-State's Beef Cattle Institute's Ask the Experts rounds out today's show. This week, Brad White, Dustin, Pendell, and Phillip Lancaster talk about differences between raising and purchasing replacement heifers. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Wednesday show with an agricultural law update. And as always, we're joined with K-State and Washburnlaw professor Roger McEowen. Roger, thanks for joining us today.
Good to be with you, Shelby.
Roger, talking about a few different topics today, and the first one being buying farmland with a growing crop and how that's a unique issue.
Well, it's an important issue from a tax standpoint for several reasons, one of which is if I'm buying land with a growing crop on it, I can't take any allocated deduction for that crop. In other words, when we buy farmland, what we like to do from a tax standpoint is we allocate value to the different items of property that we're acquiring it. So fences, irrigation equipment, whatever it might be, and we set that up and depreciate it. Well, I can't get any deduction for a growing crop, so there's no separate allocation for that value.
And so kind of cost being an issue of how much things actually cost because who knows what the crop will be.
Right. And I would say the IRS has not been clear on the issue with respect to a growing crop. But what I think you do is you capitalize the crop into the land itself, and then you get a deduction when the income from the crop is reported or fed to livestock. And that could be in a different tax year than the year in which the crop is actually sold. So it depends on whether there's a deferred payment contract that's involved or not, and it becomes a timing issue for clients.
And is there maybe another option that producers might want to look into before buying the land?
Yeah, one thing is maybe to lease the ground before you buy it. If you know you're going to buy it, maybe you can structure an arrangement with the seller that you could lease the ground. Therefore, you get the deduction for the input costs associated with that crop on the ground that you're buying. And so, therefore, if you buy it during that term, you're the farmer. You have been the farmer all along. You get to claim the deduction. But that requires some pre-planning.
And if leasing isn't an option, who should maybe producers talk to before pulling the trigger to buy that farmland?
Well, they should talk with their tax advisor. And hopefully the tax advisor is aware of these things and can help them structure those arrangements or at least suggest what you should do to get the best tax advantage for your position on your return before you actually buy the land.
And Roger, another important topic to probably a lot of producers is what is livestock and why is the definition of what is livestock important?
Well, the definition of livestock can vary depending on for what purpose we need the definition for. And, for example, there are certain instances in the tax code where bees count as livestock, poultry count as livestock, but yet for other definitions in the tax code, other purposes of the tax code, bees and poultry, for example, don't count. Bees would be insects, and they don't count as livestock. And what I mean by this is there are favorable rules in certain situations that apply to livestock, and if what we're talking about doesn't qualify as livestock, then you can't take advantage of those rules.
What about livestock being a pet versus farm animal?
Well, we see that come up frequently in zoning issues. There might be a zoning ordinance in town or in a homeowners association that says that you can't have livestock. Well, I've got a potbelly pig. What's a potbelly pig? Is it a pet or is it livestock? For those old enough to remember, I tend to see tax in just about everything that seems to move. My wife accuses me of having this problem. You remember the old show Green Acres. It's before your time. But Arnold the pig was on Green Acres. Now, is Arnold livestock or is he a pet? And that comes into play when you have an ordinance that says you can't have livestock. Well, I don't have livestock. I have a pet pig. So what is it? So you have to be very careful if you're a drafter of an ordinance or you're a drafter of a zoning law or you're a board president of a homeowners association and you want to get a resolution passed. So we don't want livestock in our homeowners association. Well, you can't just say livestock. So because you get into these side issues. For example, if I've got a homeowners association or I've got a small town or whatever the case might be, and I'm prohibiting livestock, but yet I have somebody that has some bee boxes, some beehives in their yard, is that permissible or is it not? So we often get into the issue of what is livestock from a zoning perspective, but we can also get into it from a tax perspective too.
Also with what is livestock, sometimes the factor of being unborn livestock or even semen gets thrown into that mix.
Yeah, semen is wannabe livestock. That's not livestock yet. And so we often think of that with respect to security agreements when if I'm a lender and I want to take an interest in a farmer's collateral and I'm defining it as livestock and so forth, well, semen's not going to be picked up in that. I have to specifically state that. And that can be a big issue depending on what that farmer is doing. Maybe they're doing artificial insemination, which, by the way, is what I thought AI always referred to. Now that refers to something else that I was totally caught off guard by that. By the way, I did see a flyer at the law school. We were having an AI symposium. And I thought, well, wait a minute, why wasn't I invited to this? We're talking about artificial insemination, and some of the other professors looked at me like I was from Mars. What? It's artificial intelligence. I said, well, okay, we're talking we got two different worlds going on here. In ag, that's artificial insemination. But if we're a lender to a farm client that is engaged in providing breeding services, well, then we want to retool our security agreement and financing statement to say livestock products thereof and unborn young of livestock, including semen. We need to be specific as well as general. So it makes a difference in a number of areas of the law that we often don't think about.
So for producers, if they're kind of in a bundle, they really need to make sure things are spelled out before agreeing to anything.
Yeah, in a whole host of areas, whether we're talking tax, whether we're talking zoning ordinances, whether we're talking a security agreement. Yeah, draft broadly. What I like to tell lawyers is draft broadly, but then be specific so that you catch it.
And something else important to livestock often is going to the vet. And recently in your article, you wrote about a veterinarian's lien.
Yeah, under Kansas law, as is in the case in many states, a veterinarian can get a lien for their services that they haven't been paid for. So a farmer goes or a livestock owner goes to a veterinarian, has services rendered for an animal or for their livestock herd, and or the vet comes out to the farm or the ranch, renders the services, and if they don't get paid, the vet has a lien that they can ultimately enforce, and they can levy on some of the other assets of that farmer or garnish wages or something to satisfy the lien. The interesting thing about a lien, and the important thing about a lien, is that it has priority status over a prior perfected secured lender. So if the farmer has already pledged the cattle, for example, if it's cattle that were being treated by the veterinarian, if they've already been pledged as collateral on a loan to the primary lender of that farmer, say a bank, and a vet provides services that weren't paid for, the vet's lien will come first before the bank if it's properly perfected. You have to file to get super priority status. We had a recent case in Kansas where a vet did provide services, tried to assert his lien, but it was such a weird set of facts. He didn't know who actually brought the livestock to his office. He had worked on them in the past. He knew whose animals they were, but there was no note. They just showed up in a trailer, and so he cared for them for a period of time and ultimately wanted to get paid, and the owner of the livestock said, well, I didn't take them there. I don't know who did. There were a bunch of funny things going on in this situation. Long story short, he wasn't able to enforce his lien because he couldn't prove that the owner requested his services. But the key point on this is if you have a lien for your services, the vet lien, that will come before a prior perfected security interest if it's properly perfected.
And so a good choice to just avoid it is make sure you pay your vet and know what's actually happening with them.
That would be great. That would keep us lawyers out of these things.
And Roger, one more thing that's been in the news quite a bit, talking about ERC claims.
Yeah, the employee retention credit is just riddled with fraud. In fact, it's gotten so bad that the IRS announced in September that they were going to stop processing claims for the fourth quarter of 2023. And so it's just put a halt on everything. And even those people that had valid claims, they can't get their claims processed. So these small businesses that had a valid claim aren't going to get their credit, which they need at this point in time. And now this, again, was all virus-related legislation. And it's put together quickly, and the scammers have jumped all over it. What IRS has said now, and frankly, with respect to farms, farmers may have been misled that they're eligible for this. I don't think there's going to be very many farmers that are, because you had to show a 20% reduction in revenue. Well, even during the virus-related years and the government shutdowns that were mandated, farmers didn't have a drop in revenue. In fact, the revenue may have gone up. But they may have been coached into filing a claim by these mills that are cranking out these ERC claims fraudulently. And so what IRS has said now is, okay, we're stopping processing the claims until we can get our arms around this mess, and we're going to provide amnesty. And so if you think that you've submitted a fraudulent claim, you can withdraw that. There's a procedure for withdrawing it. If you're currently under audit, you can request withdrawal to the auditor and back out, no questions asked. If you've received a refund check and you haven't cashed it yet, you can send it back with a note on it saying that you're withdrawing your claim. No questions asked. You're out. No penalties. Nothing. So in my article that I've written, I've shown what the steps that you need to do and what you have to file to get that.
And where can people read that article, Roger? A
couple of places. My blog article can be accessed through my blog, which is accessible off the homepage of my website, which is Washburnlaw.edu/WALTR, or on Ag Manager.
Roger, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and give us an agricultural law update.
Thank you, Shelby.
That was Kansas State University and Washburn Law professor Roger McEowen. Once again, you can find his blog with this information in it by going to Washburnlaw.edu/WALTR. Again, that is Washburnlaw.edu/WALTR. I will link it in today's show notes, which you can find on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but when we come back, we'll be joined by K-State weed scientist Sarah Lancaster. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our Wednesday show now, discussing how to control mustard weeds in wheat. And to talk about this topic, we're joined by Kansas State University weed specialist Sarah Lancaster. Sarah, thanks for taking the time to join us today.
My pleasure, Shelby.
Before we hop into how to control mustards in wheat, what are mustard plants?
That's a good question, Shelby. Mustards is another name that we give to a large family of flowering plants that sometimes we call the brassicas. So some things that these plants all have in common is they have flowers that have 4 petals in the shape of a cross. And a lot of them tend to smell kind of bad because they have pretty high sulfur content in the plant. Some examples of plants that are mustards would be the crop canola. So we grow some winter canola here in Kansas, so folks are familiar with that. Some of the weeds that we find a lot of times in a variety of places would be things like shepherd's purse. Weeds that we find more often in fields would be things like field pennycress, and then bushy wallflower. And then we get into species that have mustard in the name, right? So things like pinnate tansy mustard or blue mustard. There's also wild mustard. The list goes on and on and on and on and on.
So, Sarah, since they're called mustard weeds, are they usually mustard colored?
So that's another good question, Shelby. So the flowers of a lot of these plants are yellow. Think about the canola flowers, right? Flaxweed, bushy wallflower, tansy mustard, those will have yellow flowers. But then field pennycress, shepherd's purse, those guys are going to have white flowers. There's some that have purple flowers. Blue mustard has kind of a purple lavender colored flower. So again, it's a big and pretty diverse family of plants.
Why this time of year should it be treated, and why do people sometimes miss it?
So people sometimes miss winter annuals in their fields because winter annuals have a life cycle that's a little different than the weeds that we fight in our summer crops. So winter annuals tend to spend the fall and early spring as a rosette. And so basically that means they don't have a stem. The leaves are all stacked up right on top of each other on the ground. Think of how a dandelion looks in your yard, right? The leaves are all stacked up and then it shoots that stem and it has the flower on top. That's how the mustards work. The first leaves are in a rosette on the ground, and so if you have a wheat crop that is looking good, you're not going to see that rosette unless you're either A, walking your fields, or B, you have a really bad problem. So the rosette, and then what happens is when they get ready to flower, they'll shoot up that stalk, and then the flowers will be produced on the stalk, and then they make seeds, and the story's over. Start again next year.
So is this something that producers should be out walking their field to see if it's there?
Yeah, I mean, if farmers know that they have a history of problems with these winter annual mustards in their fields, yeah, it'd be a good idea to be walking fields and be on the lookout for these guys, because now is a good time. We've had, at least here in northeast Kansas, we've had some warm weather, right? So conditions are good for spraying right now. And really, any plant that has that kind of two phases of its life, one phase is the rosette and the other phase is the flowering phase, they're so much easier to control when they're in the rosettes. So most of that's because they have much more leaf surface area to absorb the herbicides. If you think about what happens when those plants bolt, again, think about the dandelion that everyone's familiar with. There's not really a lot of leaves on that flowering stalk, right? And so as plants like mustards get taller, they still have leaves on their flowering stalks, but they become smaller, and it becomes more difficult to get the herbicide into the plant.
And is there an economic or yield benefit to going ahead and controlling the mustard weeds now versus waiting until the spring?
Sure. Any crop is going to benefit from getting a good start in terms of keeping the weeds out or keeping the weeds controlled early in the season. The other thing that's going to happen is if we don't treat them now in the fall, we'll go through the winter and they'll be competing all winter. And then you'll get into spring and just by virtue of delaying that treatment, you are going to reduce yield.
For producers who have it in their field or seeing it pop up, how do they control it?
Yeah, so there's quite a few herbicides that can be used to control mustard species. One thing I will say, though, is that this is a time when not all Group 4 herbicides are created equal. So a lot of times we think about the Group 4 herbicides, so we're talking about 2,4-D and dicamba would be the most common. We call them broadleaf weed killers, right? But this is a case where 2,4-D is going to be much more effective at controlling mustard species than dicamba, just across the board. So even though, we kind of talk about them blanket as killing broadleaf weeds, there are some differences among the weed species. So 2,4-D is a good option for these. Of course, we always have to give the caveat of the fact that if you use 2,4-D when the weed is too small, the wheat won't tiller properly. So we need to be cautious of using 2,4-D in the fall because we want to make sure that wheat is fully tillered. Otherwise, we'll really mess it up. MCPA is another option that causes less injury. It's also a Group 4 herbicide. Other choices, you could use products like Husky or Talinor to control these weeds. And then for a long time, we relied heavily, and we still rely heavily on Group 2 herbicides or ALS inhibiting herbicides for weed control in wheat. These are great because they're really selective, but the other side of the coin of ALS inhibiting herbicides is that they're prone to developing herbicide resistance. In fact, we have known populations here in Kansas of flaxweed and bushy wallflower that have developed resistance to ALS inhibiting herbicides. So, folks in those areas need to think about other things like the Group 27 herbicides if they have a mustard problem.
And Sarah, is the mustard problem in their field, is it usually just a couple or is it pretty widespread?
I've seen both. I've seen places where they kind of, like a lot of weed infestations, creep in from the neighbor's field or the roadsides. And then I've seen other places where you can tell it's been in continuous wheat for a while and the herbicide program maybe hasn't been changed up much. And the whole field, you can just see the yellow across the field.
And as we're in fall, Sarah, and temperatures have a little bit of fluctuation and can get pretty cool, but also warm back up, is there a certain temperature that is really the most beneficial for taking the time to spray these mustard weeds?
Yeah, so it's important to remember, Shelby, anytime we're spraying herbicides, that they're going to be most effective when the plants can take the herbicides in. And so this time of year, we need to be aware of temperatures in addition to dry conditions persisting in a lot of the states. So kind of a rule of thumb, because it does vary a bit from herbicide to herbicide and plant to plant, but a good rule of thumb would be 40 is probably the bare minimum, and then 50 or 60 degrees would be better. So I walked over to your studio this afternoon. Today is a great day for spraying. The temperatures are in the upper 60s. The wind's not blowing very much here in Manhattan. So it's a good time to take advantage of the weather. The flip side of that, though, I know a lot of farmers are going to want to wait to make that management decision, right? Wheat is an amazing crop in that it can withstand a lot of stress and kind of bounce back in the spring. But a lot of times folks are hesitant to put a lot of inputs into it in the fall until they kind of see how it's going to come through the winter. So, lots of different options for management there, and folks have to figure out, how to make it pencil out in their own operations.
And can crop rotation also be a possibility for managing mustards?
Crop rotation is a highly under-recognized weed control tool. A lot of the weed problems that we see through the Central Plains go back to lots of years of continuous wheat production, whether we're talking about ryegrass problems in the southern part of the state and in Oklahoma, or, we can see mustard problems and brome problems, things like that here in Kansas. So rotation is a great tool. I understand that there's currently some increased interest in canola production, right? So that's a great weed management alternative there, although probably not for mustards, unless you're growing, because they have herbicide-tolerant canola varieties. And so you could take advantage of that if you wanted to.
And as we're talking about mustards, kind of wrapping up our conversation, that blue mustards does have a little bit of a different control needs.
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier the fact that these weeds are easier to control when they are in the rosette stage before they bolt. One of the things that differentiates blue mustard from some of the other mustard species is that it bolts sooner. So a lot of times, by the time we think our, for example, 2,4-D is safe to apply, the wheat's big enough, a lot of times that blue mustard has already bolted. And so your control is going to go way down with herbicides. So it's important, you mentioned walking fields. It's important to be walking fields and to know or flying fields or whatever, to know what you have so that you can make accurate herbicide decisions going forward.
Sarah, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and share with us about control of mustards and wheat.
Thanks, Shelby. Happy to be here.
That was Kansas State University's weed management specialist, Sarah Lancaster, and she was discussing information from her recent Agronomy e-Update article, Control of Mustards in Wheat, Timely Treatment is Important. If you'd like to read more on this topic, you can do so by finding her article at eupdate.agronomy.ksu.edu. Again, that is eupdate.agronomy.ksu.edu, and selecting the November 2nd issue. While you're there, you can also sign up to receive these weekly newsletters from K-State's Agronomy Department. There are articles wrote by many specialists within the department. All of these things will also be linked in today's show notes, which you can find on agtoday.net. And as always on agtoday.net, if you missed a previous show or having to cut this one short and don't want to miss out on any information, you can find it there. We're now cutting to a short break on Agriculture Today, but when we come back, we'll have this week's Ask the Experts from K-State's Beef Cattle Institute.
You're tuned back into Agriculture Today. I'm Allie Nippert for Shelby Varner, and we conclude our Wednesday show with this week's Ask the Experts from the Beef Cattle Institute.
Hi, welcome to Beef Cattle Institute's Ask the Experts. I'm Brad White, and this is the program where our experts will answer your questions. And I've got two great experts with me today, Dr. Dustin Pendell from Ag Econ.
Good morning.
And Dr. Phillip Lancaster from here at VetMed, who does nutrition.
Hello, guys.
So on this show, we've got a chance to answer your questions. If you have a question for us, you can send it to us at bci@ksu.edu. And then as they answer their questions, they'll get up to 10 points for their answer. And today's listener question is a good one, and it is, should I buy or try to raise my replacement heifers? Dustin, I'm going to you first.
That's a really great question. I think there's a lot of different things that can go into this when you're thinking about it, such as relative feed cost, what's the price of calves at this time of year, what kind of facilities do you have, what kind of management level do you maybe have for your operation, what's the herd size. If I need to pick a couple, I would assume I'm a smaller herd. If I'm a smaller herd, I would probably look to purchase because I want to bring in some new genetics. Smaller herds probably have an outside the farm job, so my management's not going to be there all the time, so it's going to have a little bit less hands-on. If I had to pick, that's probably what I would do, is purchase them.
Okay, so with some assumptions, pick and purchase them. Start out with 5 points for Dustin. Phillip?
I'm going to go for the genetic angle, but my preference would be to raise my own because I can control the genetics better. I can control when those heifers were bred. I can control when those heifers were born so that they fit in with my calving season a lot better. I might purchase some here or there if I want to bring in some new genetics on the female side, but overall I would prefer to raise them myself. Depending on costs and things like that, I think I could probably raise them for about the same price as I could purchase them for.
Knotted up 5-5, and kind of what you're saying is your importance of genetics is the same to you, but you're going to bring in maybe new genetics on the male side instead of the female side more often, and you get to pick your genetics. So follow-up question. So since you're going to purchase, how do you identify the right heifers for your operation?
Oh, that's a really good question. I guess I would probably talk with some seed stock producers, try to figure out what works for my situation, find various seed stock producers maybe in my region, have a good reputation, visit with them, try to figure out what kind of genetics they have I'm looking for in my herd. And then finally what I would do, before I did any of that, I probably would also pencil everything out. I would sit down and figure out, build a spreadsheet or use a spreadsheet that's already out there at your local land-grant university. Figure out, is it cost effective to, raise my own or purchase replacements.
Okay. So figure out which ones fit into your operation by talking to some of the other folks, finding out what has worked in the past, and go through the process of thinking about what are some of the spreadsheet answers to this question.
Yep, definitely, as Phil mentioned, just work through the economics and then kind of interview people, just figure out what's out there and what would work best for your situation.
Excellent. So 8 points for Dustin. Phillip, I'm going to turn to you since you were going to raise your own, and I asked him about how he'd pick which ones fit into his operation. I'm going to ask you the same question, except you're picking from among calves you've raised.
Mm-hmm. So I think the first thing that I want to do is I want to tag those calves at birth because one of my most important criteria is age, because I want those heifers that were born in the first 21 days of my calving season, because they are more likely to reach puberty early enough that I can get them bred to calve in the first 21 days of the calving season. And so that then those become they've got a higher probability of becoming a long-lasting cow in my herd. My next criteria is weight. I want to look for heifers that are average weight or maybe a little bit better, but I don't want them to be too heavy because I don't want really large-size cows. And then I'll start looking at some of the other genetic traits from the bulls that those cows were bred or those heifers came from.
Absolutely. Several good criteria. So as we've wrap up today, it looks like you can make a choice on which of those works best for your operation. Phillip ended up with 9, Dustin with 8. If you have questions for us in the future, send us an email at bci@ksu.edu.
Once again, that was Kansas State University's Beef Cattle Institute's Brad White, Dustin Pendell, and Phillip Lancaster. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.